They branded the alien princess a monster, but a human kissed her scars. They called her a monster long before she ever opened her eyes to look upon the faces of those who condemned her, long before her hands were shackled in heavy iron cuffs that pressed against skin too raw to heal, long before the scars that laced her slender frame were used as proof of what they claimed she was, an abomination carved out of fear and propaganda, a warning the galaxy told itself so it could sleep better at night. And yet when the human pilot first saw her in the dim cargo bay, chained like an animal beneath flickering lights, the word that left his lips was not monster, but something else entirely, softer, heavier, because for all the hatred that wrapped around her like rusted chains, what he saw first was not claws or teeth but trembling, desperate eyes that were fighting to stay alive. The transport ship smelled of recycled air and scorched metal, the kind of place where dignity was stripped away as efficiently as oxygen scrubbers strip carbon dioxide from the air, and he should have looked away like the others, should have kept walking as if she was nothing more than a piece of dangerous cargo to be delivered to those who paid in credits and blood. But he stopped because something about the way she tried to fold her body in on itself, to take up less space than she already did despite the shackles keeping her bound, tore through the armor he had built around himself as a soldier, a pilot, a man who had been told his job was not to feel, only to obey. She was branded, not just by the jagged scars that trace across her shoulders and back, but by the crude ink marks humans had burned into her skin, words in a language meant to humiliate, to reduce her to a label: monster, property, alien, dangerous, all the names they spattered her stitched into her flesh by cruel hands, and he wondered for a long, silent moment how anyone could look at a being so clearly broken and still call her dangerous, still call her anything other than what she was, someone surviving against every odds stacked against her. His orders were clear: guard the cargo, maintain silence, do not engage, because engagement risks sympathy, and sympathy risks treason. But the longer he stood there, boots heavy against the grated floor, the more he realized he was already in dangerous territory, because he was thinking, and once you allowed yourself to think, to question, it was only a matter of time before orders stopped making sense. She must have felt his gaze, because she looked up, slowly, as though expecting another strike, another sneer, another cruel confirmation that she was less than nothing, but instead she found eyes that didn't shift away, and in that fragile moment of connection, something unspoken passed between them, something that broke through the years of walls and branding and fear, and he almost hated himself for letting her see it, because it meant she would expect more, hope for more, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to give it. He had flown through storms of plasma fire, had watched comrades turn to dust under collapsing hulls, had stood in the silence of vacuum and accepted it, but nothing felt as dangerous as a weight of her gaze, nothing felt as irreversible as a tiny spark of recognition that passed through him. For a long time after, he told himself he should walk away, that he could not undo what the galaxy had already written in its books, that one man's defiance meant nothing against the weight of empires that had decided she was less than human, less than worthy. And yet he stayed long enough to notice the way her breaths came shallow, controlled, as though she had trained herself not to show weakness even while caged, stayed long enough to notice that beneath the bruises and scars was not something monstrous, but something heartbreakingly familiar, the same pulse of life, the same fragile body trying to hold itself together. He remembered the propaganda holos, the speeches by generals who stood before armies and spoke of her kind as nightmares in flesh, threats to humanity's survival, demons cloaked in alien skin. And he remembered the cheers of soldiers, the way they raised their fists and promised to burn out every last one. But he had seen nightmares, and they did not look like her. They did not look like someone who flinched at shadows, someone whose scars were not trophies but punishments carved again and again until she could barely lift her head. His fingers tightened against the rifle slung across his chest, his training screaming at him to tame, to keep distance, to remember that one look did not erase the danger, that her kind had been in wars against his, that entire colonies had burned when alien fleets crossed the skies, and yet his heart whispered louder, told him that wars were built by those who never touched the ground, and maybe, just maybe, she had never been the monster they said she was. When the alarm suddenly blared, when the deck shuddered under a strike from unseen fire, when red lights painted everything in flashes of danger, he expected himself to run to his post, to follow drills beaten into muscle memory. But his first instinct was to look at her, and he saw her chains rattle as she flinched, saw the way her lips pressed tight as though preparing herself not for battle but for execution, because in her world, chaos never meant rescue, only another round of cruelty. His hands moved before his mind caught up, unclipping the emergency release on her restraints as the ship shook again, and when the cuffs fell away, when the weight left her wrists and she cradled them like they were foreign, he realized he had crossed a line, not just broken orders, but shattered them, because there was no going back once you freed the thing the galaxy called a monster. She looked at him with a mix of disbelief and terror, as if freedom itself was too dangerous to trust, and he wanted to tell her she wasn't a monster, that the only monsters were the ones who chained her, branded her, beat her until she bled. But the words stuck in his throat, so instead he did the only thing he could. He extended his hand, palm open, no weapon, no force, and waited. The hesitation stretched like an eternity, the alarms echoing around them, the ship trembling as more fire hit its hull, soldiers shouting orders in the distance. But for him, none of it existed except her eyes, wide and glistening, and the fragile moment where choice became everything. When her hand finally touched his, shaking, uncertain, but real, he felt it like a fire searing through him, burning away years of lies and training, because in that moment he knew he wasn't protecting cargo, wasn't disobeying orders. He was saving someone the world had tried its hardest to erase, someone the galaxy had called a monster but who, against all reason, against all cruelty, still reached out for another's hand instead of recoiling. And as he pulled her to her feet, as the ship groaned and alarms howled, as the weight of treason settled on his shoulders like a blade ready to fall, he thought only of one thing. If the galaxy wanted to call her a monster, then let it. But he would call her something else entirely. The cell door groaned open again, the sound slicing through the stale silence. And the human who had kissed the alien princess's scars stepped back into the shadows before the guard could notice him, his pulse thundering in his ears as two figures entered, dragging what looked like a slab of equipment between them. It was an interrogation unit, cruelly efficient, its edges glinting with the sharp promise of pain. And as they shoved it into place, the alien princess flinched, her entire body curling inward as though she already knew what was coming, because she had endured it too many times before. Yet somehow she didn't collapse under the weight of dread, instead lifting her chin, eyes blazing with quiet defiance, and the human clenched his fists, nails cutting into his palms, because every instinct screamed to lunge forward, to tear the weapons from the guards and shield her with his own body. But he forced himself still, knowing one wrong move too soon could doom not only her but himself as well. And he had to wait, had to watch, had to choose a moment that mattered. They strapped the alien princess to the cold frame, the metallic restraints locking around her wrists and ankles, her skin pale against the steel, and when one guard sneered and muttered "monster" under his breath, she only stared back, unflinching, though her breathing grew uneven, betraying the fear she tried to bury, and the human saw something then, something fragile and furious all at once, like glass burning with fire, that made him vow in silence that he would never allow them to break her. Again, the guards activated the device, currents of energy sparking faintly along its coils, and her body arched with the first surge, a sharp cry escaping her throat despite her resolve, echoing through the chamber, and it took everything in the human not to break cover, because the sound was more than pain. It was humiliation. It was a system trying to prove that no matter who she was, no matter her lineage, she was only what they branded her, a monster to be displayed, tortured, controlled, erased. He looked at the control panel and memorized its sequences, his mind racing through possibilities, until at last the guards tired of their cruelty, leaving her slumped and trembling in the restraints, and when the door shut behind them, silence fell again. But this time it was thick with her ragged breathing, with a faint hum of the machine cooling down, with the weight of what he had witnessed, and he knew this was a moment he had to act or lose everything. He moved quickly, stepping out from the shadows, and her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with shock, confusion, and something else. Hope, maybe, though she seemed afraid to trust it. And he whispered, "I'm getting you out of here," as he reached for the restraints, his hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through him, because he couldn't let her see his fear, couldn't let her think he doubted. And when the locks disengaged with a hiss, she sagged forward into his arms, her weight, lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that contradicted the strength she had shown, and he held her carefully, whispering again, "You're not a monster," as if repeating it enough could erase the scars etched into her mind as deeply as into her skin. She managed a faint, bitter smile, whispering back, "That's what they all say before they turn away." And the human shook his head, answering softly but fiercely, "I'm not turning away," before helping her to her feet, steadying her as she staggered, her legs weak but her spirit flickering back to life in the way she tightened her grip on his sleeve, refusing to collapse. The escape was a blur of stealth and desperation, slipping through narrow corridors lit by red emergency lights. The hum of engines beneath their feet a reminder that the ship was still adrift in hostile space, every corner threatening discovery. But somehow they moved together in a rhythm, as though bound by something deeper than circumstance, her silence a shield, his determination a blade. At one point, alarms blared, and they ducked into a maintenance shaft, the walls vibrating as soldiers thundered past, shouting orders, their boots ringing against steel. And in that tight space, pressed close together, he felt the trembling of a body against his, but also the steady rhythm of a breath evening out, as though she drew strength from the fact that he had not abandoned her yet. And when she looked up at him, eyes wide and unguarded, he knew then that his life was no longer his own, that everything he was now belonged to ensuring she survived, that if the galaxy wanted to call her a monster, then he would fight the galaxy itself to prove them wrong. Finally, after what felt like hours of crawling, running, and hiding, they reached the auxiliary hangar, where a small shuttle lay docked, half forgotten among repair bays, its hull scarred but functional, and he whispered urgently, "This is our chance," guiding her toward it. But as they neared, the hiss of hydraulics filled the air, and a squad of guards spilled into the hangar, weapons raised, eyes hard with recognition and malice. And the alien princess instinctively stepped behind him, her hand gripping his shoulder, though she whispered, "You should leave me. You still have a chance to live if you give me up." And he turned his head just enough to meet her gaze, answering through clenched teeth, "Not a chance," before pulling her down behind a stack of crates as blaster fire lit the hangar in streaks of red. He fired back with the sidearm he had stolen, the recoil biting into his palm. But his focus was razor-sharp, every shot aimed not for glory but for survival. For her survival, until finally, after a brutal exchange, the last guard fell, and the hangar was silent except for the echo of their breath, harsh and ragged. They scrambled aboard the shuttle, systems flickering to life beneath his desperate hands, and as the engines roared, lifting them free from prison ship, the alien princess slumped into the co-pilot's chair, staring out at the stars as though seeing them for the first time in forever, tears shining in her eyes, not of weakness but of release. And when she whispered, "Why would you risk everything for me?" the human glanced at her, his voice low but unshakable as he answered, "Because you're not what they say you are. Because someone had to see you for who you really are. And because if I didn't, I wouldn't be human anymore." For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the engines and the vast emptiness of space. And then, slowly, she reached for his hand, her fingers brushing over the scars on his knuckles, as though recognizing that they both carried wounds the galaxy refused to understand. And when she whispered, "Maybe you're the monster, for caring about me," he smiled faintly, replying, "Then I'll be your monster." As the shuttle surged into the black, carrying them toward whatever future waited, uncertain, but finally theirs to choose. The chamber where the alien princess and the human now stood was not the same place where they had first crossed paths. It was brighter, louder, filled with the vibration of alarms and the echo of boots slamming against steel as soldiers tried to storm in through every access point. Yet somehow the two of them were alone in that final moment, standing at the heart of the Empire's flagship with a galaxy's worth of judgment pressing down on their shoulders. And though the alien princess's skin still bore the scars carved into her by whips, flames, and shackles, though her eyes still carried the haunted shadows of being caged and branded, there was something else in them now, defiance, raw and unbroken, mirrored in the human's gaze as he tightened his grip on the sidearm and glanced toward the reinforced blast doors buckling under the weight of ramming charges they had minutes at most. Perhaps less, and yet in that shrinking pocket of time, choices would be made that would echo across stars. She turned to him, voice soft but carrying the weight of centuries of a people's pain. "They will never stop. They will never let me live as anything more than what they have made me." And for a moment he wanted to deny it, to tell her that escape was still possible, but the truth sat like a blade between them. There was no corner of the Empire where the story of her scars had not been twisted into propaganda. No world where her chains had not been broadcast as proof of her kind savagery. Even if they fled into the blackest depths of space, the Empire would hunt them until they were dust. "Then we don't run," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice to a whisper only she could hear as he touched her trembling hands. "We make them remember you differently, not as a monster, not as their captive, but as the one who stood here who looked him in the eye and broke the lie. For a heartbeat she stared at him, caught between disbelief and the burning flicker of hope she had buried so deeply she no longer recognized it. And then, almost unwillingly, she let out the smallest, shuddering breath of laughter, brittle but real, before she nodded, and together they turned toward the central console of the flagship, its glowing interface still pulsing with the Empire's seal. The human slammed his palm against the control surface, overriding protocols of the codes he had stolen during his years of service, and the ship's vast comms array came alive with a hum that vibrated through the floor, through their bones. Within moments, every ship in orbit, every relay in range, every world tuned into the Imperial feed would see and hear what unfolded here. The blast doors shuttered again, cracking at the seams, but it was too late for the Empire to stop them. The alien princess stepped into the center of the chamber, the light of the recording halo wrapping her in gold, softening the shadows of her scars, though they remained visible, raw, and unhidden. And for the first time in her life she did not cover them, did not flinch from them. She raised her chin and spoke, her voice steady even as her body trembled. They branded me a monster so that you would fear me, so that you would bow to them, but these scars are not proof of my cruelty. They are proof of theirs. Silence crackled across the galaxy, the storming of soldiers muffled by the roar of her words now carrying across 1,000 worlds, and behind her, the human stood like a pillar, ready to fight until his last breath if they came through those doors, but knowing the battle had already shifted. She was no longer the prisoner, no longer the experiment, no longer the Empire's trophy. She was a truth too large to be contained. She lifted her hand and for a moment faltered, then felt his hand brush against Hayes, grounding her, steadying her, before she drew in a breath and added, "They told you I was less, that I was dangerous, that I was not worthy of love, but one of your own saw me as I am, broken, scarred, but alive, and in that I found my freedom." The doors finally gave way with a deafening crack, soldiers pouring in with rifles raised, their visors reflecting the scene, but the broadcast caught it all, not the Empire's carefully staged narrative, but the human stepping forward, pressing his lips softly, unflinchingly against the ridges of her scars, the most tender defiance possible in the face of armored brutality. And in that single act the galaxy saw not a monster but a woman, not a weapon but a life, loved without hesitation. The soldiers froze, their training colliding with the human truth unraveling their orders in real time, and the hesitation spread like fire through their ranks, through the fleet watching above, through the worlds that had always obeyed because they had believed a lie. The hesitation grew into doubt, and doubt into something the Empire could never crush. Gunfire never came. Instead, the silence of rebellion bloomed, fragile yet unstoppable, and though the human knew they might not survive the next hour, though he knew this flagship could become their tomb, he looked into her eyes and saw that survival was no longer the point. This was immortality of another kind, the kind written not in monuments but in memory, the kind carried not by victors but by the free. The alien princess leaned into him, her forehead against his as soldiers lowered their weapons one by one, and she whispered, almost to herself but loud enough for the universe to hear, "They called me a monster, but you gave me back my name." And when the flagship's feed finally went dark, long after the Empire's commanders realized their power had slipped from their grasp, the story was already alive across 1,000 worlds, of scars kissed instead of feared, of a princess who stood unbroken, and of a human who chose love over obedience, and that story could not be caged, not by chains, not by war, not by death.